Okay, so here we are. We are ready to do some, start off with some big stitch. I just wanted to bring in a little example of something that I've made myself using big stitch. So if I bring this up to the camera a little bit there, you can see that on the whole I'm using straight stitch, but I also use a curve stitch there. I can work with designs that are already on the fabric. So in this case my stitches go up to this darker shade here and then stop and then restart here. So you can play with this in that way. You can bring the stitching closer together, as you can see here. And at this point I even, I don't know if the camera picks that up, but there's a stitch line that even follows some of the drawing detail that's in the fabric. So that's the big stitch. This is how it looks on the back, and it's possible to probably see that it's actually done with what's called a space dyed or variegated yarn, so it actually changes colour. So it's blue and then it has little orange flecks on it as well, which I personally love. So that's a big stitch sample. So let's do some sewing. So what I'm going to do is going to zoom the camera back in a wee bit. There we go. Okay, so now because we are working on quite a small panel, we can pretty much start wherever we want. It's not normal practice, however, when you're working on larger pieces, larger hangings, larger quilts, to start anywhere near the edges. You would normally, particularly with, well, with any quilting, but particularly with whole cloth quilting and hand stitching, I would normally work in the middle and then slowly work my way out to the edges. And what will happen then is it means that the backing and the wadding will all work together until you move out. Sometimes if you start stitching over here and then you go over to here, even when you've basted your quilt, it can start to bunch up and you get little bits where you've got more fabric in one area than you have at the back, or vice versa. So traditionally you would work from the centre out, but because we're working on quite a small panel, I think we're going to be all right. Okay, so I will leave that up to you. Okay, now you might have got a particular kind of like design that you have in mind. I think it's quite nice to approach this as a sample just to see what happens. But as makers and designers, you might have different ways of wanting to work. Okay. So with doing the big stitch, there's lots of different things that we can play around with. So I'm using the sashiko thread that came with the pack. Okay, this is actually considered a thin or a fine sashiko thread. There are thicker ones that we can be using. For example, this in the pack that I got for this one, this thread is a thicker thread, which I'll come to in a bit. At the moment I'm just working with this fine one. It's quite a nice one to start out with. So we've inserted our thread. Okay, the knot is caught up in our wadding. Okay, and then what we just want to do is we just want to go, so that's the point where my thread comes out. I'm just going to work on a straight-ish line here. Okay, so I'm just going to go through, pierce all the way through my fabric so my needle comes to the back. And then what you can do is you can just kind of just pull it straight back through if you want, quite random. But if you want to be a bit more controlled about it, then you want to kind of get a pressure when you're pushing down your fabric, so that you can feel where the needle is going to come through and you can see just how wide that gap is going to be. And it's very much a kind of like a practice and intuition thing where you will just start to get to know how regular you want your stitches, or how irregular you want them. Sometimes if you want them irregular, it's actually quite hard because you end up doing them quite regularly, so that can be a difficulty in itself. So don't know if you've noticed what I'm doing is, rather than me pushing my needle in at a sideways kind of angle like that, what I'm actually doing is I'm doing something called stabbing. So I put my needle in and it's at a 90-degree angle to my fabric, and then I push it in so it goes straight through from the front to the back. Okay, if I go in at an angle like that, there's quite a chance, and I can feel it, that it's moved along. So the hole, I don't know if you can see the hole in the light there, the hole where I stabbed it through is just there, but when I pushed it through sideways, it didn't come through till about there. So you can end up getting really different kind of like sizes and qualities. So I would stab my needle in, pull it down until I can feel it at the point where I want to push it back through, and that way you will get pretty even stitches on the back. So whatever you've left the gap here on the face of the fabric is the size that the stitch will be on the other side. If you don't do the stab and the putting it back through at quite a sharp angle, then you can often end up with much smaller stitches on the back in that gap because the thread is all caught up in the middle, and you might want to do that. That's perfectly fine, okay? But equally you might be thinking, actually no, I want to control this a wee bit more. Now the other thing you might notice is that I might be that I'm just doing one stitch at a time. Now I'm going to show you how to do that so that you don't do one stitch at a time. Personally, I really like doing one stitch at a time. I don't do this quilting, this method of quilting, hand stitch, because I find it super quick to do. I do it because I actually just really enjoy taking my time with it and going slowly. So I personally quite enjoy just doing one stitch at a time. When I go back, my line going back, I'll show you how you can do it multiple stitches at a time while still relatively controlling those stitch sizes. So we've got a line. It's relatively straight, okay? Apart from that first stitch, which I did when I wasn't really thinking about it. So I've got this relatively straight line. It's at a slight angle, each of the stitches, but I'm absolutely fine with that. But I've got quite a nice even, I can feel that my fabric is relatively flat. And these are my stitches on the back, which again are very similar size, regimented size to the ones on the front here. Okay, now we've come to the edge of our fabric here. You may have stopped here, you may be close to the edge, it depends on what you're wanting to do on your fabric. Now excuse me. Now what I could do, because I'm quite close to the fabric and actually it would look appropriate to have another stitch there, so if when I come to put my binding on here, that would cover that up slightly, okay? Or what I could do is I could tuck my thread in here. Now if you come to the end, I personally would actually just go across, stitch to the edge and then stitch back down there to come back down here. However, I want to show you as a learning process, you can join me if you want to, how if I decided now that I wanted my line to go to start a line in a different place and I didn't want to knot it off at this point, what I would do, I'll just turn this round, okay, is I would make my stitch however long I want it to be. I'm going to, in this case, just make it shorter so that it stays within the framework of the design at the moment. And what I'm doing is, rather than going, I am actually now, I've got my needle at a similar angle to my fabric, okay, so it's horizontal to the fabric, just like slightly off that. And this time, instead of stitching down and stabbing, I am going to go through, but just like when I started off with my knot at the beginning, I'm not going to go all the way through to the back. So the needle's not there on the back, and I'm just going to wiggle it so it gets caught in that wadding until I get to the place where I want to bring my next line back across, which is going to be, I fancy, about just under an inch, just over a centimetre. I'm going to do a second line. Okay, so I've just come up back through the front of my fabric there. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is just show you how, if I wanted to do a line but do several stitches at a time, how I would do that. Okay, so I'm just going to do the first stitch just to get me going, so I'm not right on the edge of the fabric. Now I could be trying to follow the same size stitches as I've got going on here, so that's entirely up to you. I personally am just going to do a line. I'm not going to worry about matching up with these. If I start trying to match up with these here, then at other points I need to do the same. Although it could be really nice to have a section where your stitches do all line up, so it makes this more formal line like so, and then in other places they might really clearly not match up and you're going to get a much more of a broken line. So in itself that could be a really nice thing to do. But for now, just while we're learning, I'm just going to do another line across there. So to do multiple stitches at once, okay, I've got my fabric lifted up. I'm going to still do the stab, okay, and I'm still looking at doing stitch sizes which are approximately the same. Stitch size on the face and gap. So we've got our stitch and our gap. So I've stabbed it through, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull it through as if I was just going to do one stitch, and then when I come to do my next stitch, instead of pulling the needle through, I pull it to the point where I want the edge of my next stitch to be, and I pull the needle up, which will pull the fabric up, and I stab it back down again, and then I go to the next point, get to the next point where I want the needle to go in, just about to go in there, and I just pull that needle up and stab it through. So this way I can do multiple stitches at once. Okay. Now, because we're doing large stitches and we're using a large needle, or I'm using a long needle, I'm not sure if you are, okay, we can get quite a lot of stitches on one at once. Once you've pulled that through, just get the tension right, just pull on it a little bit, excuse me, so that you've got your stitches all there. So it is a quicker way to weave, stitch, wrong head, wrong hat. Okay, and sometimes I feel like it, but actually I do really like just doing individual stitches generally, which is slower. But kind of part of that point, as I spoke about in the presentation of whole cloth quilting, is it doesn't have to be a quick thing, but equally it can be if you want it to be. So, which is really nice. It does mean you can actually probably make a quilt in a day. Well, I certainly can, and that's quite a nice thing. So, actually what I'm going to do here is I'm going to stop here, because what I want to do is I'm going to show you how to finish an end when it might not be at the edge of the panel, where we put our knot back into the centre of the cloth. So we managed to get it to a stage where the knot's in the centre of the cloth, where we start, and we want to do the same when we finish. Okay, so to do that, I'm actually going to try and zoom in even closer, and hopefully you can see what I am doing here quite clearly. Okay, so what you want to do is, if you're going to do this, you want to do this before you start to run out of thread. If you've only got about an inch of thread left to do, this is very, very difficult to do, particularly if your needle is longer than an inch. Okay, so I always try to do it when I've got a good kind of like 2, 3 or more inches left on my thread. Okay, there's not much of a thread shortage going on there, and just saving a couple of inches will make the kind of like the finishing of the quilt or the panel a lot stronger visually. So how do we do this? So we're going to do, I want to do one more stitch, which is just going to come off the edge of this yellow. Actually, I might do it so it might be nice to end on this yellow, so I'm going to do a shorter stitch for this last one. So I'll start off the yellow there, and I'm going to end on the edge of the dark yellow there. Okay, so to do that, what I want to do is I decide where my needle is going to go into the cloth, which is that point there. Okay, and I'm going to come, when I come out, I'm going to come out about 1 centimetre, 1.5 inches-ish away from where I have finished my stitch. Okay, so what I want to do is I take the yarn thread as it is coming out of the fabric. I take my needle, okay, and I don't want to do this up here, okay, and then go down there, although you can do, because you can pull the thread down. What I actually want to do is I want to do it a bit closer so I can control it a bit more. So I'm just down towards the fabric. I'm going to wrap my thread around my needle. Now, in the same way as we decided whether to 1, 2, 3 or 4 wraps around our needle when we were doing our quilter's knot at the beginning, we make the same decision here. Okay, so if we think that 1 wrap around it is going to make a big enough knot, you want to have the knot the biggest you can without damaging the fabric. So I think in my case 1 wrap is just a bit too thin. I managed to pull it through with 2 knots at the beginning, so I'm going to do 2 wraps around my needle. Okay, and I'm going to pull my needle to the point where I wanted to go through, and I'm just going to get that thread wrapped around the needle kind of at that point. It's not right at the end of the needle, it's just a bit further away, and I'm going to go through my fabric, but again I'm not going through the backing, and I'm doing that little wiggle until I come out, what's that, about 1.5 inches or just over 1 centimetre, or not 1.5 inches, 3/4 of an inch or something like that, just over 1 centimetre away. So I just, not too tightly, but I'm just putting a bit of tension on my thread there as I pull my needle through. Okay, I've pulled my needle through and the knot is just there. Now it depends on how big your stitch is. I just want to hold that roughly in place. So I'm pulling the yarn slowly. I never do it that quickly. Okay, I'm not doing it slowly specifically for this video. I just carefully pull that through. So the knot, let me bring this up to the camera if that focuses. It might not. Yeah, so the knot is just currently sitting where the needle went into the hole, but the knot's still on this side. So when I put that back down, okay, being careful not to have the needle in my hand. I can even take the needle off the thread at that point, okay, and I'm just going to get hold of this thread, okay, and I'm just going to yank that through, and it probably made the knot too big, so I'm going to have to carefully, this may have happened to you, there we go. So the knot has now gone into the fabric, okay. I can pull that back so that I've got the right tension there. Okay, there we go. Unedited, problems happening, so I've just managed to keep pulling that through. I can feel the knots actually here, even though my thread's out there. And then what I just do is I pull on my thread and try to push my fabric down a little bit. And then if I cut it, I want to get as close to the fabric as I can without cutting the fabric. So I've done that. So when I then flatten that back out, my thread has disappeared into the background. There's no knot, sorry, there's no knot here on the back of the fabric. It's all hidden within here. Okay, so that is how we start. We do our stitching and then we finish, okay, essentially. Okay, and that's all you need to know. But there are many other things that we can do with this. Okay, so what we're going to do next is we're going to, in the next video, we're going to explore small stitches. Okay, so that's working with a thread that is more of a machine needle, machine sewing thread, or you can use whatever thread you want, but I'm going to concentrate on doing a bit of small stitch. Once we've done that, we've got the principles of the two types of stitching, and we can play around with different weights of yarns, starting to explore motifs and other things. Okay.